Hiromichi Shinohara, the deadly warrior of the skies. 1939. On June 27, 1939, over Tamsak-Bulak on the border of Manchuria and Mongolia during the Soviet-Japanese border conflict, a massive aerial dogfight took place involving over 150 airplanes. One of the men in the thick of this fighting was a 26-year-old pilot. His name was Warrant Officer Hiromichi Shinohara of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force. This was just before World War II had begun, and nearly 2.5 years before the Japanese had entered that war after their attack against the U.S. Pacific Fleet on the morning of December 7, 1941. The battles of Khalkhin Gol, also known as the Nomonhan Incident, are today largely forgotten, but at the time these Soviet-Japanese border conflicts were both bloody and costly. They lasted from May to September of 1939, with over 45,000 casualties and around 360 aircraft destroyed. The air combat was on a scale and ferocity not seen since the aerial bloodbath that was called Bloody April in 1917 on the Western Front in World War I. During the 4-month-long border clash between the Japanese and the Soviet Union, it's estimated that both sides combined flew over 12,000 sorties, with nearly 3 million rounds of ammunition being fired and over 2,000 tons of bombs being dropped. The conflict ended in a humiliating defeat for the Japanese. It had its roots back in 1931 when the Japanese invaded Manchuria in northwest China. Relations with its neighbor, Soviet-backed Communist Mongolia, quickly became strained and in 1938 erupted briefly in open warfare. This resulted in the Battle of Lake Khasan during the short-lived Changkufeng incident. Though a diplomatic solution was quickly found and hostilities ceased between the two sides, a dispute where the Manchurian-Mongolian border actually was still persisted. On May 11, 1939, a detachment of Mongolian cavalry wandered over the border to find land to graze their horses on. This caused the Manchurians to send a large cavalry detachment who chased off the intruders. Nevertheless, things quickly escalated over the next few weeks, and the skirmishes between the two sides became more and more intense. By June, what had been a minor border dispute had become a full-scale, high-tech conflict involving a large number of planes and tanks, including the giant obsolete Soviet Tupolev TB-3 heavy bomber and the very latest Japanese Mitsubishi K-21 Sally high-speed bomber. Towards the end of that month, the Japanese launched a full-scale assault on the Soviet and Mongolian positions in an attempt to bring the conflict to a quick conclusion. This attack would ultimately fail, despite the Japanese offensive being heavily supported by large numbers of their bomber and fighter aircraft. It was, in fact, the first time air power had been used on such a large scale to support an advancing army. It also resulted in some of the largest air battles since World War I. So, the giant air battle over Tamsak-Bulak on June 27th was a pivotal moment in the Japanese offensive. Warrant Officer Shinohara had just started flying combat sorties for the first time and was with the 11th Squadron of the Japanese Imperial Army Air Force. They had just been redeployed to the newly built airfield at Saenjo, which was located in western Manchuria, east of the border with Mongolia. The base was highly important as it was the nearest Japanese airfield to the front line. Shinohara was a career pilot who was the son of a peasant farmer. He had risen through the ranks of the Army Air Force after transferring from the cavalry back in 1932 at the age of 19. Though from the start of his career he had been flying fighter aircraft. It wasn't until 7 years later in 1939 that he saw his first combat mission. By the time the Soviet-Japanese border conflict had started, he was flying the modern Japanese monoplane, the Nakajima Ki-27 Nate, which was the forerunner of the legendary Mitsubishi Zero. The Nate was a highly capable fighter aircraft, but lightly armed with just a pair of medium machine guns. Despite this, Shinohara managed to shoot down 4 of the very latest Soviet Polikarpov I-16 fighters on his very first combat mission. This was an incredible accomplishment as the Soviet Polikarpov I-16, nicknamed the Donkey, was a tough opponent with abilities that easily matched that of the Japanese Nate. Shinohara's dogfighting technique quickly became apparent and was compared to that of a lone wolf when hunting an enemy. He very much liked flying alone, patiently stalking his prey from above until he found the right moment to pounce. So the next day he added a further 6 enemy aircraft to his tally by using the classic Japanese tactic of swooping down at high speeds on the enemy and then turning sharply, firing as he did so. Using this tactic, he shot down 5 antiquated Polikarpov I-15 biplane fighters and a Polikarpov RZ Soviet light bomber that day. There was a rumor at the time that as one of the escaping I-15 pilots was parachuting to Earth from his damaged aircraft, Shinohara's wingtip clipped the man's chute, causing it to tear and fall apart. This caused the man to fall several thousand feet to his death. It's not known if Shinohara did this deliberately or by accident, but his record was otherwise spotless. Young Shinohara had become a flying ace in just the first 2 days of going into combat for the very first time. He continued to score more aerial victories over the Soviets in the coming weeks. Then, on June 27th, he shot down 11 enemy aircraft in just 1 day, a feat only surpassed by a handful of other pilots who were all Luftwaffe aces during World War II. In July, he showed great courage when he landed his aircraft on the battlefield in an attempt to rescue a downed fellow pilot. But unfortunately, his aircraft was damaged in the landing, so he and the other pilot had to be rescued while under fire from advancing Soviet tanks. By August 27, 1939, he had amassed an amazing 55 victories. In the afternoon, he was escorting a bomber formation over Mohorehi Lake on its way to attack a Mongolian stronghold. Shinohara flew ahead of the bombers to act as the lead aircraft, and shortly afterwards he was attacked by a large pack of Polikarpov I-16 fighters. Shinohara, though hopelessly outnumbered, managed to shoot down 3 of the attackers before his plane was hit, sending it spiraling downwards in flames, killing him as it crashed into Lake Mohorehi. He had just celebrated his 26th birthday a few weeks before. Recovered from the charred and mangled wreck of his aircraft was a watch, his brass identity tag, a can opener, and oddly enough, a German Mauser Model 1914 automatic pistol he had liberated off a Soviet prisoner of war. Shinohara was posthumously promoted to the rank of Flight Officer Second Lieutenant. Before he died, he had shot down a total of 58 Soviet aircraft in less than 93 days. His tally was never surpassed by any other Japanese Army pilot, though some Japanese naval pilots during World War II went on to shoot down more planes. It is a sad fact that very few Japanese pilots who lived through the border conflict survived the onslaught that was World War II. Such was the intensity of the Pacific War, coupled with the complete and utter destruction of the Japanese Air Force in the brutal fighting at the end of the war in 1945.
Hey, Simple History fans! Get me your very own limited edition Simple History Soldier plushie. Available to purchase for just 3 weeks from September 4th to the 18th at $24.99 US plus tax and shipping. And once pre-orders are fulfilled, I will ship out 60 to 80 days after the campaign ends. Once I'm gone, I'm gone. Head over to the link in the description below to get your limited edition Simple History plushie today.